Most people never notice it. That's the strange thing. Brown hair is everywhere on the street, in classrooms, in offices, in photographs, in mirrors, and yet it almost never inspires curiosity. It doesn't feel like a mystery. It feels like the default, like background noise, like something that was always there and never needed an explanation. But that assumption is wrong. Brown hair did not quietly exist while other traits fought for attention. It did not patiently wait while blue eyes, blonde hair, and red hair took the spotlight. Brown hair moved fast, faster than almost any visible human trait ever has. And tonight we're going to talk about how something so ordinary became so dominant, not by accident, not by beauty, not by chance, but by pressure, movement, and survival. This is not a story about fashion. It's not a story about attractiveness. It's not even a story about genetics in the way most people think. This is a story about speed, because long before anyone ever admired hair color, long before mirrors, long before societies, borders, or even names, brown hair was already winning. Imagine the world before cities, no roads, no houses, no permanent settlements, just land, vast, uneven, dangerous land stretching farther than the eye could see. Human beings did not live in this world. They moved through it. They followed animals. They followed seasons. They followed water. And as they moved, their bodies were tested relentlessly. Every feature, every variation, every tiny difference was judged not by culture, not by preference, but by whether it helped or harmed survival. Hair was not decoration. Hair was equipment. It shielded the scalp from sun. It reduced heat loss at night. It acted as a barrier between skin and environment, and its color mattered more than we usually admit. To understand why brown hair spread so fast, we have to go back to a time when almost everyone had dark hair, but not necessarily the same kind of dark hair. Early humans were not visually diverse in the modern sense. There were differences, yes, in build, in facial structure, in skin tone, but hair color variation was narrow. Pigmentation was high, darkness dominated, and this wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. Dark hair contains more melanin. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation. It protects the skin and underlying tissue from damage. On an exposed scalp under an open sky, this mattered a lot. Hair that was too light offered less protection. Hair that was too sparse increased risk. Hair that failed under intense sun or long exposure was a liability. So for tens of thousands of years, darker hair remained stable, not exciting, not rare, just effective. But stability is not the same as dominance. Dominance requires movement. And humans were about to move farther, faster, and into harsher environments than ever before. When humans began migrating out of Africa, they didn't do it once. They did it again and again and again. Wave after wave, group after group, splitting, rejoining, adapting, failing, surviving. And with every migration came a new set of pressures. Different sunlight, different temperatures, different food sources, different threats. Some traits struggled to keep up. Brown hair did not. Because brown hair wasn't just dark, it was flexible. Not as intensely pigmented as black hair, but not fragile like lighter variants. It existed in a middle zone that turned out to be incredibly resilient across environments. In high sunlight, it still protected. In lower sunlight, it didn't overcompensate. In mixed climates, it adapted without severe cost. This balance mattered. Traits that sit at extremes can excel in specific conditions, but they struggle when conditions change rapidly. And conditions were changing fast. Human migration was not slow and gradual. It was erratic, sometimes desperate, sometimes opportunistic. Brown hair survived all of it. There's a common misconception that traits spread because they're chosen, that people picked them. That early humans looked at each other and preferred one hair color over another, the way modern societies sometimes do. But for most of human history, attraction was secondary. Survival came first. If a trait increased the likelihood of living long enough to reproduce, even slightly, it spread. If it reduced that likelihood, it faded. Brown hair didn't need to be admired, it only needed to not fail. And again, across continents, climates, and generations, it didn't. Another reason brown hair spread so fast is deceptively simple. It's genetically dominant. But dominance doesn't just mean common, it means persistent. When brown hair genes mix with lighter hair genes, brown often wins, it overrides, it masks, it remains visible even when diluted. This meant that as populations mixed, which they did constantly, brown hair was rarely erased. It blended, absorbed, and continued. Blonde hair needed isolation. Red hair needed isolation. Blue eyes needed isolation. Brown hair did not. Thrived in contact zones, the places where populations met, traded, migrated, and intermarried. And those zones were everywhere. Think about how humans actually lived. They didn't stay in neat, separated groups forever. They collided, they merged, they replaced one another, they absorbed smaller populations, they were absorbed themselves. And every time that happened, the traits that could survive mixing survived history. Brown hair was one of those traits. It didn't disappear when people moved. It didn't vanish when groups blended. It didn't require special conditions to persist. It just kept showing up, generation after generation. What's interesting is that brown hair doesn't announce itself as an adaptation. It doesn't look extreme. It doesn't look specialized. It looks normal, and that's precisely why it spread. Evolution often favors traits that don't draw attention, traits that quietly reduce risk without demanding anything in return. Brown hair didn't demand specific sunlight levels. It didn't demand specific temperatures. It didn't demand specific diets. It asked for almost nothing, and in return it offered consistency. As humans spread across Eurasia, brown hair became the connective tissue between populations, not uniform, never identical, but familiar. From the Middle East into Europe, from Central Asia outward, from early agricultural societies into growing settlements. Even when lighter hair appeared later, brown hair remained the baseline, the default, not because it was original, but because it was fast. It arrived early, it stayed stable, and it moved with people. Here's something rarely talked about: traits that spread quickly often become invisible. Once a feature is common enough, it stops being noticed. It becomes the background against which everything else is compared. Brown hair didn't become dominant because it was special. It became dominant because it didn't need to be. It didn't rely on rarity. It didn't rely on isolation. It didn't rely on cultural reinforcement. It relied on movement, and humans were moving faster than ever before. By the time societies began forming permanent settlements, brown hair was already embedded across enormous regions. Not everywhere, not yet, but enough that it could no longer be erased. From that point on, other hair colors didn't replace brown hair. They appeared alongside it, and that difference matters. Brown hair wasn't a trend, it was infrastructure. As agriculture emerged, as populations grew denser, as people began living closer together, brown hair's genetic persistence only strengthened. High-density populations mean more mixing. More mixing means dominant traits consolidate. This is where brown hair truly accelerated, not because it suddenly became advantageous, but because it was already positioned perfectly. It didn't need a mutation, it didn't need selection pressure to favor it more, it simply rode the wave of human expansion. By the time recorded history begins, brown hair is no longer just widespread, it's assumed. It's so common that it stops being described in detail. Texts note unusual hair colors, art highlights extremes. Brown hair fades into the crowd, and that's the final trick of its success. When a trait becomes so universal that it disappears from attention, it has already won. But this is only the beginning, because brown hair didn't just spread once, it survived challenges. It competed with newer mutations, it coexisted with traits that grabbed attention. It persisted through cultural shifts that favored the rare over the common. Rarity changes everything. The moment a trait becomes uncommon, it stops being just biological. It becomes symbolic, it draws attention. It invites stories, preferences, myths, and meanings. And this is where many people assume brown hair should have lost ground, because this is the era when lighter hair appears. Blonde, red, variations that catch the eye, variations that seem new, unusual, striking against the familiar background of darker pigmentation. But brown hair didn't retreat, it didn't vanish, it didn't get replaced, it didn't slow down. Instead, it absorbed the shock and kept moving. To understand why, we have to be careful not to romanticize rarity. Rare traits feel powerful to us now because modern societies reward visibility. But for most of human history, rarity was not an advantage, it was a risk. A rare trait meant uncertainty. Would it protect? Would it survive different climates? Would it fail under stress? Most new mutations don't spread. They disappear quietly, carried by a few individuals who never pass them on widely. The fact that lighter hair colors survived at all is remarkable, but survival is not dominance. And brown hair had already built something lighter traits didn't have yet: scale. By the time lighter hair mutations began appearing in certain populations, brown hair was already deeply embedded across large interconnected groups. This matters more than it sounds. When a new trait appears in a small population, it needs either isolation or extreme advantage to spread widely. Without one of those, it stays local. Blonde hair found isolation. Red hair found isolation. Certain eye colors found isolation. Brown hair didn't need it. It already existed everywhere people were moving. So instead of being replaced, it became the reference point, the backdrop against which rarity stood out. Think of it like language. A dominant language doesn't disappear just because dialects form. Dialects exist within it. They borrow from it. They rely on it. Brown hair became the linguistic base of human pigmentation. Other hair colors emerged as accents, noticeable, meaningful, but dependent on the larger structure remaining intact. This is why even in regions famous for lighter hair, brown hair never disappears completely. It's woven too deeply into the genetic fabric. There's another misconception worth dismantling here. People often imagine evolution as a ladder, one trait replacing another in clean steps. Dark hair replaced by brown, brown replaced by blonde, and so on. That's not how it works. Evolution is layered, traits stack, they overlap, they coexist, they interact. Brown hair didn't get replaced by lighter hair. Lighter hair appeared on top of an already brown-haired population. And because brown hair genes are dominant, they didn't step aside politely. They stayed visible generation after generation. Now consider what happens when societies begin assigning meaning to traits. Hair color becomes noticeable not because it affects survival directly, but because humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We notice differences, we talk about them, we attach stories to them. This is where brown hair's invisibility becomes one of its greatest strengths. It avoids scrutiny. While rare traits attract attention, both positive and negative, common traits slip through cultural filters almost untouched. Brown hair didn't become a target, it didn't become exotic. It didn't become controversial, it stayed neutral, and neutrality is powerful. As populations grew and societies became more complex, social selection began to matter alongside biological selection. Preferences formed, biases formed, ideals formed, but these forces didn't erase brown hair, they worked around it. Why? Because brown hair was already associated with most people. It wasn't tied to a single region, it wasn't tied to a single group. It wasn't rare enough to define an identity on its own. That made it adaptable not just biologically, but socially. There's an irony here. The more common brown hair became, the less anyone questioned it. Traits that dominate tend to stop being explained. No one asks why gravity works when it's always there. No one asks why the sky is overhead. No one asks why brown hair is everywhere. And that lack of questioning allows dominance to persist unchallenged. As trade routes expanded, as migrations intensified, as empires rose and fell, populations mixed at scales never seen before. This should have diluted brown hair. Instead, it reinforced it. Every large-scale mixing event favors traits that survive recombination, traits that don't disappear when genetic lines cross. Brown hair didn't fracture under mixing, it consolidated. This is where speed becomes visible again, not speed in generations, but speed in geography. Brown hair crossed borders effortlessly. It moved with merchants, with soldiers, with farmers, with refugees. Wherever people went, brown hair was already compatible with the environment waiting for them. It didn't need adjustment. Contrast this with lighter hair colors. In some environments, lighter hair offered no advantage. In others, it came with trade-offs. Its spread required either cultural reinforcement or geographic containment. Brown hair required neither. It survived deserts and forests, plains and mountains, tropics and temperate zones. It wasn't perfect everywhere, but it was good enough almost everywhere, and good enough everywhere beats perfect somewhere. As centuries passed, brown hair became entangled with human normalcy, not excellence, not exception, normalcy. And normalcy shapes expectations more deeply than ideals ever do. Children grew up seeing it everywhere. Artists painted it without comment. Stories included it without description. Brown hair didn't become invisible because it lacked importance. It became invisible because it had already won. What's often overlooked is how resilient dominance really is. Once a trait reaches a certain threshold, removing it becomes nearly impossible without extreme forces. Brown hair reached that threshold early. Even when societies began favoring lighter hair aesthetically in certain eras, the underlying genetics didn't follow fashion. Preferences fluctuate faster than genes, and brown hair simply waited them out. There's something deeply human about this pattern. We chase novelty, we admire rarity, we tell stories about exceptions, but our biology is built on stability. Brown hair represents that stability. It is the quiet majority, the reliable baseline, the trait that doesn't demand attention to persist. And this brings us to a crucial realization. Brown hair didn't spread because it was extraordinary. It spread because it was robust against climate, robust against migration, robust against mixing, robust against cultural change. Few traits can claim that. Modernity didn't begin with machines, it began with reflection. The moment humans could reliably see themselves, not in water, not in shadow, but clearly, appearance changed meaning. Faces became familiar, features became comparable, differences became noticeable in new ways. And hair color, once just another functional trait, stepped into a different role. This is where many people expect brown hair to lose relevance because modernity loves distinction. But once again, brown hair didn't disappear. It changed how it existed. Before mirrors, hair color was mostly something others saw. After mirrors, it became something you carried consciously. You knew it, you recognized it, you could imagine yourself through it. This self-awareness altered how traits were perceived, but it didn't alter which traits endured. Brown hair entered modernity not as a novelty, but as a constant, and constants behave differently under attention than rare features do. When portraits emerged, painted faces preserved in time, artists didn't exaggerate brown hair. They treated it as structural, a frame for expression rather than the subject itself. Light hair drew commentary, red hair drew symbolism. Unusual colors drew interpretation. Brown hair framed identity without defining it. That subtle difference is crucial, because when a trait becomes symbolic, it becomes vulnerable to trends. When it becomes structural, it becomes resistant to them. As societies grew more stratified, appearance became entangled with class, occupation, and identity. Clothing changed rapidly, hairstyles changed, accessories shifted with fashion, but underlying hair color remained stubbornly stable. People dyed their hair, they styled it, they hid it, they reshaped it. Yet when those layers were stripped away, brown hair was still there, waiting. This is the moment where biology and culture diverge. Culture can move quickly, biology cannot. Brown hair had already secured its place biologically. Culture could decorate it, reinterpret it, even temporarily reject it, but it couldn't erase it, and that created a strange tension. Brown hair became both ubiquitous and overlooked. As populations exploded, cities grew dense. Millions of people lived closer together than ever before. Visual sameness increased. In crowded environments, rare traits stand out more sharply. They become markers. They become conversation starters. Brown hair, by contrast, dissolved into the crowd, and paradoxically, that made it safer. Traits that stand out attract attention. Attention invites judgment. Judgment invites pressure. Brown hair avoided that entire cycle. It's important to understand how powerful this kind of invisibility is. In evolutionary terms, being unremarkable can be an advantage. Unremarkable traits are rarely selected against. They're rarely targeted, rarely singled out. They pass through generations quietly. Brown hair perfected this strategy long before humans were aware of it. As the modern world expanded through colonization, trade, and industrialization, human mixing accelerated again, this time on a global scale. People who had never met before shared cities, families, and futures. Once again, this should have destabilized common traits. Once again, brown hair absorbed the impact, because global mixing favors traits that don't rely on isolation, and brown hair never did. In the age of measurement, science began categorizing humans in ways that would have been impossible before. Hair color charts, skin tone scales, eye color classifications. Suddenly, brown hair wasn't just common, it was quantified. And when quantified, it became the midpoint, the average, the reference. Every other hair color was defined in relation to it. Lighter than brown, darker than brown, redder than brown. Brown hair became the 0 point, This positioning reinforced its dominance in a subtle way. When something becomes the reference standard, it anchors perception. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to be promoted. It doesn't need to justify itself. It simply exists as the baseline against which variation is measured. Now consider how identity politics and aesthetics evolve in modern societies. Groups seek distinction. Individuals seek uniqueness. Appearance becomes a tool for expression. Hair dye explodes in popularity. Styles change rapidly. Colors become temporary. But underneath all of that experimentation, natural brown hair remains the most likely starting point. Even rebellion begins from it. You dye from brown. You contrast against brown, you return to brown. The cycle always passes through it. There's another layer here, one that's uncomfortable for some discussions: bias. Throughout modern history, physical traits have been unfairly associated with intelligence, morality, trustworthiness, and competence. Brown hair, again, sits in an odd position. It is neither exoticized nor heavily stigmatized across most cultures. It occupies a zone of assumed normality. And while that normality can erase individuality, it also avoids extreme bias. Brown hair didn't become a symbol of superiority, but it also avoided becoming a symbol of otherness. That neutrality allowed it to persist socially as easily as it persisted biologically. Media reinforced this quietly. Protagonists, background characters, authority figures, everyday people, brown hair appears everywhere, often without comment. It doesn't define roles. It doesn't demand explanation. It simply fills space, and filling space is how dominance looks when it's complete. As the 20th century accelerated, everything sped up, trends changed faster, cultures collided harder, identities fractured and reformed. Yet brown hair remained remarkably unchanged, not frozen but steady. It didn't resist change aggressively. It didn't chase relevance. It endured. What makes this endurance remarkable is that it doesn't rely on perfection. Brown hair is not the strongest pigment. Not the rarest, not the most striking. It sits in the middle biologically, visually, socially. And the middle is where survival often hides. When people talk about human evolution, they often focus on dramatic shifts, mutations that stand out, adaptations that look impressive in hindsight. But most of evolution is quiet. It's about traits that persist without fanfare. Brown hair is one of those traits. It didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. By the late modern era, brown hair had become so widespread that discussions of human diversity often skip over it entirely. We talk about extremes, about outliers, about what's rare or unusual. Brown hair doesn't fit neatly into those narratives, which is exactly why it continues to exist everywhere those narratives are told. And now in the present, something curious is happening. For the first time in history, biology is no longer the final authority over appearance. Technology can override genetics temporarily. Culture can reshape aesthetics instantly. And yet, despite all of this, brown hair remains dominant. Even when altered, it returns. Even when ignored, it persists. This raises a question that's easy to overlook. What happens to a trait that has already optimized for survival in a world that no longer selects the same way? Does it fade? Does it become irrelevant? Or does it continue doing what it has always done, quietly adapting, blending, and remaining? Dominance rarely announces itself. When people imagine something that won, they picture conflict, replacement, triumph, one thing defeating another, one trait pushing the rest aside. But most real dominance doesn't look like that. It looks like persistence. It looks like endurance. It looks like being present before anyone thought to question you, and still being present long after the question stops being asked. Brown hair is not dramatic dominance, it is quiet dominance. There is a bias in how humans tell stories about success. We focus on disruption, on change, on the moment something appears, but we rarely focus on what remains when everything else cycles in and out. Brown hair belongs to that second category. It doesn't represent a moment in time. It represents continuity across time, and continuity is harder to notice than change. When a trait becomes dominant early, it shapes the environment that follows. Later traits don't compete on neutral ground, they compete inside a world already structured around what came before. Brown hair shaped expectations of what normal looked like long before alternatives arrived. That meant lighter or rarer traits were never judged on equal footing. They were always compared to brown hair, not alongside it. Comparison reinforces the reference point, and brown hair was already the reference. This matters when we think about why dominance persists. Once a baseline is established, removing it requires enormous pressure. Not just biological pressure, cultural, environmental, and social pressure all at once. Brown hair never faced that level of opposition. No environment consistently punished it. No culture universally rejected it. No biological mechanism systematically removed it, so it stayed. Another overlooked factor is how dominance interacts with averages. As populations grow, averages matter more than extremes. Large populations amplify middle traits. Extreme traits, very rare or very specialized, can survive in small or isolated groups. But when populations scale up, the center of the distribution grows heavier. Brown hair sits squarely in that center. It benefits from numbers. Every generation reinforces it simply by existing. Think about how quickly novelty exhausts itself. A rare trait draws attention at first, then it becomes familiar, then it becomes ordinary within its niche, and if it lacks structural support, it fades. Brown hair skipped that entire cycle. It never needed novelty. It didn't rise because it was exciting. It didn't survive because it was admired. It survived because it was reinforced every time humans reproduced at scale. There's a temptation to see this as boring, but boredom is a modern luxury. In evolutionary terms, being boring means being stable, and stability is priceless when the world is unpredictable. Consider how many environmental shifts humans have lived through. Ice ages, droughts, warming periods, rapid climate oscillations. Brown hair didn't need recalibration for each one. It didn't lock humans into a narrow survival window. It allowed flexibility. And flexibility beats specialization when change is constant. This flexibility also explains why brown hair pairs so well with variation elsewhere. Different eye colors can appear alongside it, different skin tones, different facial features. Brown hair doesn't constrain the rest of the system. It integrates. That integrative quality is part of why it spreads without resistance. At this point, it's worth confronting a subtle illusion. Because brown hair is common now, we assume it was always destined to be. That's not true. Many traits could have dominated if conditions were different. But brown hair happened to align with multiple pressures at once: genetic dominance, environmental resilience, compatibility with migration, and neutrality under social selection. Few traits align across that many dimensions. Brown hair did. There's also the question of timing. Brown hair didn't just appear early, it consolidated early. Timing matters in evolution. A trait that spreads before populations explode gains a permanent advantage. It becomes embedded before alternatives have the numbers to challenge it. Brown hair locked in its position before human populations reached massive scales. By the time billions of people existed, brown hair was already everywhere. At that point, displacement was no longer possible. This leads to a counterintuitive idea. Brown hair is not common because it spread slowly over time. It is common because it spread fast enough early. Fast relative to population growth, fast relative to migration speed, fast relative to environmental change. Once that window passed, dominance was sealed. People often misunderstand speed in evolutionary contexts. They imagine it as rapid mutation. But the fastest traits are often the ones that don't change, the ones that move intact across generations and geographies. Brown hair moved intact. It didn't need reinvention. It didn't need repeated selection events. It just needed humans to keep moving. As humans moved, they carried brown hair into new contexts where it didn't need to compete aggressively. In many cases, it was the only viable option. Lighter hair might appear, but it rarely replaced brown hair. It layered on top of it. Brown hair remained the base. This base status has psychological effects as well. People unconsciously treat baseline traits as neutral. They don't attach strong assumptions. They don't expect explanation. That reduces friction. And friction, even social friction, can influence reproduction patterns over long time spans. Brown hair avoided friction. Even in eras where beauty standards elevated lighter hair, brown hair didn't vanish. Why? Because standards influence preference, not inheritance, and preference fluctuates faster than genes. Brown hair simply waited. There's something almost paradoxical about how little effort dominance requires once it's established. Brown hair does nothing to defend its position. It doesn't resist change. It doesn't need protection. It doesn't need reinforcement campaigns. It is reinforced automatically by scale. And this is where many discussions about human traits go wrong. We focus on what's visible, what's discussed, what's argued over. But the most powerful traits are often the ones that no one argues about anymore. Brown hair exited the debate thousands of years ago. If we zoom out far enough, brown hair becomes less a feature and more a background condition of humanity, like walking upright, like having 5 fingers, like language capacity, not universal but foundational. This doesn't mean brown hair is better in any moral sense. Evolution has no morals. It means brown hair solved enough problems well enough early enough that nothing could meaningfully dislodge it. Self-awareness changes the rules. For most of human history, traits simply existed. They were inherited, expressed, and passed on without reflection. But once humans began thinking about themselves, not just surviving, but interpreting who they were, biology entered a new phase. Choice appeared. Not real choice at first, more like the illusion of it. But even illusions can redirect behavior over long stretches of time. Hair color, once silent, became negotiable. And this is where many people assume brown hair would finally weaken. It didn't. The ability to alter appearance through grooming, dye, disguise, or symbolism introduces friction between biology and identity. People begin to ask, what do I look like? What do I want to look like? What does this say about me? These questions are new in evolutionary terms, and yet even under this pressure, brown hair remains stable. Why? Because conscious alteration does not erase unconscious inheritance. Hair dye is one of the most revealing inventions in this story. It gives humans the ability to temporarily escape genetics, to try on difference, to simulate rarity. And what does that reveal? That the most common starting point is brown. Most dye charts assume it. Most transformations begin from it. Most before images are brown hair. Even attempts to escape dominance confirm its presence. You don't rebel against something that isn't there. There's a subtle psychological loop at work. Because brown hair is common, people who have it are more likely to imagine alternatives. Curiosity grows in the middle, not at the extremes. Those born with rare traits often define themselves through them. Those born with common traits are freer to experiment. Ironically, that experimentation never threatens the underlying dominance. It circles around it, returns to it. Another illusion worth confronting is the idea that cultural preference can overpower biology. It can influence expression. It can influence perception. It can even influence mating patterns slightly. But over large populations and long timescales, preference is weak compared to inheritance. Brown hair doesn't need to be preferred to persist. It only needs to be unopposed. And opposition requires coordination at scales humans have never achieved. Consider this: there has never been a civilization where brown hair was systematically discouraged across all levels of society, across all generations, across all reproductive patterns. Not once. Some cultures favored lighter hair, some mythologized it, some associated it with status, but those preferences were always partial, temporary, local. Brown hair remained beneath them. This is another reason dominance feels invisible. True dominance doesn't require enforcement. It doesn't require ideology. It doesn't require repetition. It persists because removing it would require more effort than anyone can justify. As self-expression expanded, brown hair gained a new role. It became a neutral canvas, something you could build on, not something that defined you. That neutrality is underestimated. Traits that define identity too strongly can become constraints. They shape how others perceive you, sometimes against your will. Brown hair rarely does that. It lets identity be built elsewhere, on behavior, speech, belief, profession. That makes it socially flexible. Flexibility is a recurring theme here. Biological flexibility, environmental flexibility, social flexibility. Brown hair fits into all three, and traits that fit into multiple systems are extraordinarily hard to remove. Now let's slow down and consider the scale of time again. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that time, brown or dark hair dominated. The era of conscious self-modification, dyes, fashion, mass media is a blink, less than a single % of our species' existence. We are trying to judge evolutionary outcomes from the shortest chapter of the book. Brown hair is not impressed. There's also something quietly stabilizing about brown hair in mixed societies. In highly diverse populations, common traits reduce visual segmentation. They blur boundaries. Brown hair appears across ethnicities, regions, and ancestries. That makes it less likely to be used as a marker of us versus them. Traits that avoid being politicized tend to survive longer. Brown hair avoided politicization simply by being everywhere. This does not mean brown hair is free from stereotypes. Nothing that common is. But stereotypes attached to brown hair are weak, diffuse, and inconsistent. They don't cohere into a single narrative. And without a strong narrative, selection pressure remains minimal. Another misconception is that modern medicine and technology have ended evolution. They haven't, they've changed its shape. Selection pressures are softer now, more indirect, but inheritance still operates. Brown hair still benefits from dominance in mixed populations. Every generation, probability does its work. Probability is the unsung hero of this story. Not destiny, not design, not intention. Just probability applied at scale. When something is likely enough, often enough, across enough people, it becomes inevitable. Brown hair crossed that threshold long ago. This is why conversations about the future of hair color often miss the point. People ask whether brown hair will decline, whether technology will replace genetics, whether diversity will dilute dominance. They misunderstand how dominance works. Diversity doesn't erase baselines. It multiplies variation around them. Brown hair doesn't need to be exclusive to remain common. It only needs to remain compatible. And it is. There's a deeper lesson embedded here beyond hair color. Human success has often come from traits that do not stand out: endurance, adaptability, tolerance for variation. Brown hair is a physical manifestation of those qualities, not flashy, not extreme, reliable. As we approach the present moment, something interesting emerges. The more humans emphasize individuality, the more foundational traits fade into the background. People define themselves by choices, not inheritance, and yet inheritance continues quietly beneath those choices. Brown hair continues doing what it has always done, existing in large numbers across contexts without asking permission. Winning does not always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like being so thoroughly integrated into the structure of reality that no one thinks to question you anymore. No celebration, no recognition, no debate, just continuation. This is the strange position brown hair occupies now. It hasn't disappeared, it hasn't evolved into something else, it hasn't been replaced, it has simply become assumed. An assumption is one of the strongest forms of dominance there is. When humans talk about evolution, they often imagine it as a contest with clear winners and losers. But most evolutionary success doesn't produce trophies, it produces stability. Brown hair is not the end result of a competition that ended. It is the ongoing result of a process that never stopped, and that process favors traits that can pass through every phase of human history without breaking. To see how rare this is, consider how many traits didn't make it. Countless physical variations appeared and vanished without leaving a trace. Slight differences in pigmentation, subtle structural changes, local adaptations that couldn't survive migration, mixing, or time. We only remember the survivors. Brown hair survived not because it was unbeatable, but because it was unbreakable. There's a subtle distinction here that matters. An unbeatable trait dominates aggressively. An unbreakable trait persists quietly. Unbeatable traits can fall when conditions change. Unbreakable traits adapt just enough to avoid collapse. Brown hair never needed perfection. It needed durability. Durability is not glamorous. It doesn't inspire myths. It doesn't attract worship. It doesn't demand explanation. It simply keeps working. And that is why brown hair feels so invisible today. It doesn't signal anything urgent. It doesn't demand interpretation. It just is. As we move deeper into the modern era, humans increasingly experience themselves as separate from biology. We talk about natural traits as if they are optional, as if technology has freed us from inheritance. In a sense, it has, but not in the way people imagine. Technology allows temporary override. Biology determines default return. Brown hair is the default return. Even when someone changes their hair color permanently through artificial means, the genetic reality remains unchanged beneath it. Children inherit probabilities, not preferences, and probabilities do not care about fashion. Brown hair remains the most probable outcome. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. For all our talk of individuality, most of what we are is statistical. We inherit likelihoods, we express averages, we embody distributions. Brown hair is the visual expression of probability doing its work at scale. People often ask whether dominance is fair, but fairness has nothing to do with it. Evolution doesn't reward justice, it rewards continuity. Brown hair represents continuity across environments that changed faster than any organism could predict. It is the trait that survived unpredictability. There is also something deeply humbling about this story, because it reminds us that humans are not the architects of their own physical foundations. We decorate them, we reinterpret them, we sometimes resist them, but we did not design them. Brown hair was not chosen. It emerged, persisted, and spread long before anyone had an opinion about it. If we strip away modern meaning, brown hair is simply a solution, not the best solution, not the most elegant, just one that works in many contexts without failing catastrophically. And solutions that work broadly tend to spread. Now consider how modern society values optimization. We chase peak performance, we seek specialization, we admire extremes. But biological systems don't prioritize optimization the way human systems do. They prioritize resilience. Brown hair is resilient. It does not collapse under genetic mixing. It does not require narrow environmental windows. It does not trigger strong selection against it. That combination is rare. And rarity of resilience produces abundance over time. As human populations continue to mix globally, something interesting happens. Extreme traits dilute unless actively maintained. Moderate traits reinforce. Brown hair sits in that reinforcing zone. Every mixed population strengthens it statistically, not deliberately, automatically. This is why predictions about the disappearance of brown hair misunderstand basic population dynamics. Unless reproduction patterns change radically and permanently, in a coordinated way across the globe, dominance remains. Brown hair does not need protection, it needs only time. There is also a cultural paradox at work. The more humans emphasize uniqueness, the more they rely on shared baselines to make uniqueness visible. Without common traits, difference loses contrast. Brown hair provides that contrast. It allows other traits to stand out. It supports diversity by being common. In this sense, brown hair is not opposed to individuality. It makes individuality legible. Against a background of sameness, variation becomes meaningful. Brown hair is that background. We often misunderstand the role of background conditions. They feel passive, but backgrounds shape everything that appears in front of them. Brown hair shapes how other hair colors are perceived. It defines rarity. It defines difference. Without it, there would be no contrast. This is why brown hair continues to matter even when no one talks about it. It is still doing work, just not visible work. At this point in the story, it becomes clear that brown hair is not just a trait, it is a pattern of how traits succeed when humans expand rapidly, mix extensively, and adapt continuously. The pattern is this: traits that are flexible, dominant, and neutral spread fastest and last longest. Brown hair fits all three. Flexibility, it functions across climates and cultures. Dominance, it persists genetically through mixing. Neutrality, it avoids strong positive or negative selection. Remove any one of those and dominance weakens. Brown hair has all three. There is a temptation to read meaning into this, to see it as symbolic, to assign moral weight, but that would miss the point. Brown hair is not meaningful, it is effective. And effectiveness does not announce itself, it just continues. If we imagine the far future, centuries or millennia ahead, it's tempting to imagine radical change. New technologies, new aesthetics, new forms of human expression, and many things will change, but inheritance will not disappear. As long as humans reproduce biologically, probability will operate, and as long as probability operates, dominant traits will persist. Brown hair will still be there, perhaps altered, perhaps blended, perhaps expressed differently, but still present. It may no longer be noticed, it may no longer be named, it may simply exist as part of what humans look like, and that is the final stage of dominance. When a trait stops being a category, most traits do not reach this stage. Most traits remain visible, debatable, and temporary. Brown hair has moved past that. It has become infrastructure. Infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. Brown hair has never failed spectacularly, so no one stops to think about it. And that ultimately is the fastest victory of all, not conquest, not replacement, not spectacle, just persistence. There is a mistake humans make over and over again when trying to understand success. We assume success must be visible. We look for peaks, not plateaus. We look for moments, not continuities. We look for stories with beginnings and endings, but most of what actually survives has no clear climax. It just keeps going. Brown hair forces us to confront that discomfort because there is no dramatic turning point where it wins, no single era where it triumphs, no event you can point to and say this is when it became dominant. Its dominance is cumulative, and cumulative things are hard for humans to feel. Humans evolved to notice change, not stability. Change signals danger. Stability fades into the background. This bias shapes how we remember history, how we tell stories, and how we misunderstand evolution. Brown hair suffers from this bias, not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks novelty. When something changes rapidly, we record it. When something stays constant, we stop documenting it. Over time, that creates an illusion that constancy is accidental or uninteresting or inevitable. But constancy is often the most difficult outcome to achieve. Consider how fragile systems usually are. Ecosystems collapse, empires fall, languages disappear, technologies become obsolete. Yet brown hair has crossed continents, ice ages, cultural revolutions, and population explosions without losing relevance. That level of persistence is rare, and rarity of persistence is more meaningful than rarity of appearance. One way to understand this is to think in terms of evolutionary noise. The human story is noisy, random events, bottlenecks. Migrations, disasters, traits that survive noise must be resistant to randomness. Brown hair is resistant to randomness. It doesn't require precise conditions. It doesn't rely on small populations. It doesn't collapse under mixing. Noise passes through it without erasing it. This resistance to noise explains why brown hair shows up again and again in places with no obvious connection. Different continents, different ancestries, different histories. It's not that brown hair traveled intact everywhere, it's that whenever conditions allowed, it reasserted itself. Probability reassembled it. Another human error is assuming that what feels neutral must be weak. We associate strength with intensity, but in systems that operate over long time scales, intensity is often a liability. Extreme traits burn brightly and then fade. Moderate traits persist. Brown hair sits in that moderation zone, not extreme darkness, not fragile lightness. Balanced enough to avoid failure. This balance also explains why brown hair coexists so easily with variation elsewhere. It doesn't demand uniformity. It allows diversity to grow around it without destabilizing the system. Traits that require strict conditions often suppress variation. Brown hair does the opposite. It supports it. At this point, brown hair stops being just a biological story. It becomes a lesson about how humans misread success. We admire what is rare. We celebrate what is unusual. We talk endlessly about what stands out, but what carries us through history is usually what blends in. This applies far beyond hair. Languages survive not because they are poetic, but because they are adaptable. Technologies persist not because they are perfect, but because they are compatible. Cultural practices endure not because they are ideal, but because they integrate easily into daily life. Brown hair follows the same rule. Compatibility is one of the most underappreciated forces in evolution. A trait that works with many other traits will outlast one that works brilliantly alone. Brown hair works with almost everything. Different skin tones, different eye colors, different facial features. It rarely clashes, it rarely constrains, it integrates. Integration produces longevity. Longevity produces dominance. Dominance produces invisibility. This sequence explains why brown hair feels unremarkable today. It has completed the cycle. There's also a psychological effect worth noting. When something is common, people stop attributing meaning to it. Meaning migrates toward the edges, toward the rare, toward the unusual, toward the extreme. This doesn't mean the common thing stops mattering. It means it stops being discussed. Brown hair lives in that silence. Silence can be misinterpreted as absence, but silence is often the sign of something so stable it no longer needs explanation. No one debates whether humans should breathe oxygen. No one argues whether gravity should exist. These things are settled by persistence. Brown hair is approaching that category. As we zoom out even further, the story becomes less about hair and more about time. Human time is short. Even recorded history is brief compared to evolutionary timelines. We mistake short-term fluctuations for long-term trends, but long-term trends move slowly and resist disruption. Brown hair is a long-term trend. There have been periods where lighter hair became fashionable, periods where darker hair was idealized, periods where hair color carried social meaning. None of these periods lasted long enough to matter evolutionarily. They flicker. Brown hair continues. This persistence can feel anticlimactic. There is no moral payoff, no poetic justice, no narrative resolution, just continuation. And that frustrates the part of us that wants stories to end. But evolution doesn't end, it accumulates, and accumulation doesn't care whether it's interesting. Another way to think about brown hair is as a form of biological inertia. Once enough mass accumulates, movement becomes difficult to redirect. Brown hair accumulated mass early, population mass, geographic mass, genetic mass. Redirecting it would require immense force. No such force has appeared. This inertia explains why even dramatic changes in society don't rewrite basic human distributions. The surface changes rapidly. The foundation does not. Brown hair lives in the foundation. There is also something quietly egalitarian about this. Brown hair does not belong to one group. It appears everywhere humans have mixed. It refuses exclusivity. Traits that belong to everyone are harder to weaponize, harder to mythologize, harder to erase. Brown hair belongs to everyone. That universality is another reason it survives. Traits tied too closely to identity become fragile. Traits that cross identities endure. As we approach the end of this narration, it becomes clear that brown hair is not a curiosity to be explained. It is an example of how survival works when nothing dramatic happens, an example of how success can look like nothing at all. If someone in the distant future were to study humans the way we study ancient species, they might not comment on brown hair at all. They might simply note it as a baseline trait, unremarkable, and that would be the highest compliment evolution could give, because evolution does not reward being noticed, it rewards being passed on. Brown hair has been passed on more times than almost any visible human trait, not because it demanded attention, but because it never gave anyone a reason to remove it. At the very end of this story, something strange happens. The question changes. We started by asking why brown hair spread so fast, but now that we've followed it across time, across continents, across culture and biology, that question no longer feels complete, because speed was never the point. Persistence was. Speed is exciting because it looks like action. Persistence is quiet because it looks like nothing is happening. And humans, as a rule, are terrible at noticing nothing. We notice disruption, we notice collapse, we notice novelty. We rarely notice continuity, yet continuity is what carries species forward. Brown hair forces us to confront this blind spot. When we say something won, we imagine competition. But brown hair did not defeat other hair colors. It did not replace them. It did not erase them. It simply became the background against which everything else occurred. And backgrounds are not passive. They shape perception. They define contrast. They decide what counts as rare. This reframing matters, because once you understand brown hair as background rather than outcome, its dominance stops feeling mysterious. Backgrounds emerge early. They spread quietly. They resist change. Foreground elements come and go. Human history is full of foreground stories, empires, inventions, ideologies, aesthetics, all loud, all temporary. Brown hair sits behind all of them. It watched them rise, it watched them fall, it remained. There is a temptation to romanticize rarity, to believe that what is unusual must be special and what is common must be uninteresting. But rarity is not a marker of success. Rarity is often a marker of fragility. Things that cannot spread widely remain rare by necessity. Brown hair spread widely because it could. This does not diminish rare traits. They add texture, they add diversity, they add contrast. But they do not replace the background. They exist because a background exists. One of the most important insights from this story is that dominance does not require superiority. Brown hair is not superior to other hair colors in any moral or aesthetic sense. It does not outperform them in every environment. It simply avoids catastrophic failure in most environments. That is enough. Avoiding failure is one of evolution's most powerful strategies, not excelling, not optimizing. Just not breaking. Brown hair mastered that strategy early. If we imagine evolution as a series of tests, brown hair passed enough of them well enough, often enough, that it accumulated momentum. Once momentum builds, stopping it becomes nearly impossible. This is true in biology, it is true in culture, it is true in systems of all kinds, and momentum does not need awareness. Brown hair does not know it is dominant. It does not defend its position. It does not adapt aggressively. It continues to be inherited. This leads to a humbling realization about humans themselves. For all our self-awareness, much of what defines us operates without our input. We experience ourselves as choosing beings, but our foundations are statistical. Brown hair is one of those foundations. The more humans attempt to reinvent themselves, the more obvious this becomes. We change names, we change styles, we change technologies, but the deep patterns persist, not because we want them to, but because changing them would require rewriting probabilities at a planetary scale. Even now, in an age where almost any appearance can be simulated, brown hair remains the most common natural outcome, not because people choose it, but because inheritance continues to operate beneath choice. There is something oddly comforting in this. In a world that feels unstable, continuity exists. In a species obsessed with identity, there are traits that refuse to become ideological. Brown hair does not argue, it does not demand recognition, it simply continues. This story also reveals something about how humans misunderstand history. We compress it, we summarize it, we look for causes and effects that fit into clean narratives, but deep time is messy. It favors accumulation over events. Brown hair is an accumulation story. If you were to remove every cultural layer from this discussion, fashion, symbolism, preference, brown hair would still dominate. That tells us something important. Culture decorates biology. It rarely replaces it. And yet, despite all of this, brown hair remains oddly absent from our discussions of humanity. We talk endlessly about difference. We rarely talk about commonality, but commonality is what binds us. Brown hair is one of the visible threads that connects billions of people who otherwise share little. This connection is not poetic, it is mechanical. It arises from shared ancestry, shared migration, shared probability, and that is precisely why it endures. If there is a final lesson here, it is this. Success over long time scales does not look like dominance in the way humans imagine it. It looks like persistence without attention. It looks like traits that survive not because they are chosen, but because they are tolerated everywhere. Brown hair is tolerated everywhere. It does not demand explanation. It does not require defense. It does not need to be loved. It only needs to exist. And in that sense, brown hair may be one of the clearest examples of evolutionary success we have, not because it is special, but because it became ordinary and stayed that way. When future historians, biologists, or entirely different intelligences look back at humanity, they may not comment on brown hair at all. They may simply assume it. An assumption is the final stage of victory. If we slow this story down even further, slower than history, slower than culture, slower even than biology itself, we begin to notice something unsettling about how humans think. We are drawn to beginnings. We ask where something started, who invented it when it appeared. We love origin points because they give us the illusion that meaning is born in a moment, that importance arrives fully formed, that history can be traced back to a single spark. But most of what truly shapes the human story does not begin that way. It accumulates. It layers itself quietly over time, generation after generation, until one day it is no longer perceived as something that happened, but something that simply is. Brown hair belongs to this category of phenomena that never announce their arrival, because they do not arrive all at once. They seep into existence through repetition, through probability, through the slow arithmetic of inheritance that operates whether anyone is paying attention or not. When we look back and ask why brown hair is everywhere, the real answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. It is everywhere because nothing ever succeeded at removing it. That may sound trivial, but in evolutionary terms, it is extraordinary. Most traits fail not because they are bad, but because they are fragile, fragile to climate, fragile to migration, fragile to mixing, fragile to time. Brown hair proved itself resistant to fragility, not immune, not invincible, but resistant enough that every attempt by randomness to erase it failed. And randomness is relentless. Every human life is a roll of the dice. Every reproduction event reshuffles the genetic deck. Over hundreds of thousands of years, randomness should erase anything that lacks structural resilience. Brown hair endured this chaos not by defying randomness, but by cooperating with it. Its genetic dominance allowed it to reappear even when diluted. Its moderate pigmentation avoided extremes that could be punished by environment. Its compatibility with diverse populations ensured it was never isolated enough to disappear. In short, brown hair learned how to survive uncertainty. Uncertainty is the defining condition of human existence. Humans did not evolve in stable environments. They evolved in shifting climates, unpredictable landscapes, and volatile social structures. Traits that required precision died quickly. Traits that tolerated variation lived on. Brown hair tolerates variation exceptionally well. It does not demand specific sunlight conditions. It does not require specific mating patterns. It does not collapse under cultural reinterpretation. It allows humans to move, mix, and multiply without forcing adjustment. That tolerance is its hidden strength. If we step outside human bias for a moment, we can see brown hair not as a feature, but as a system response. Given a species that migrates constantly, mixes freely, and reproduces at scale, certain traits will naturally rise to prominence, not because they are better, but because they interfere least with survival. Brown hair interferes very little. It does not impose costs that require compensation elsewhere. It does not create dependencies. It simply exists, integrates, and passes on. This reveals something deeply counterintuitive about evolution. Evolution does not reward what is impressive, it rewards what is sustainable, and sustainability is rarely spectacular. Brown hair is not the brightest, not the darkest, not the rarest, not the most distinctive. It occupies the middle ground where systems tend to stabilize. In physics, chemistry, ecology, and biology, stability almost always emerges in the middle, not at the extremes. Brown hair is a biological expression of that principle. Human culture, however, resists this idea. We glorify extremes, we celebrate the unusual, we build narratives around disruption and change, but culture operates on short timescales. Evolution operates on long ones. What culture celebrates today is often irrelevant tomorrow. What evolution preserves lasts millennia. Brown hair lives on evolutionary time. This is why attempts to frame brown hair as boring miss the point. Boredom is a perception problem, not a biological one. Boredom arises when something is so reliable that it no longer triggers attention mechanisms designed to detect change. The human brain evolved to notice difference because difference often meant danger or opportunity. Brown hair stopped triggering those alarms long ago. It became safe. Predictable, expected, and expectation is a sign of deep integration. There is also an uncomfortable truth here about human ego. We like to believe that what defines us is what we choose, our tastes, our values, our expressions. But much of what defines us operates beneath choice. We are born into distributions. We are shaped by probabilities. We inherit patterns that existed long before we were aware enough to resist them. Brown hair is one of those inherited patterns. It reminds us that individuality floats on top of a vast statistical foundation. Even now, as humans manipulate appearance with unprecedented freedom, the underlying distribution remains. People dye their hair to stand out, but standing out only works because most people do not. Difference requires sameness. Brown hair provides that sameness. It makes contrast possible. It gives rarity meaning. Without it, difference would dissolve into noise. This is another way brown hair supports diversity rather than suppressing it. By being common, it creates a reference point. By being neutral, it allows other traits to carry symbolism. By being stable, it gives humans freedom to express identity elsewhere. Brown hair does not compete for attention, it steps aside, and stepping aside is sometimes the most powerful move. As we reach this deeper layer of the story, the phrase, the fast brown hair, takes on a different meaning. Fast does not mean rushed, it means early, it means timely, it means arriving before the window closes. Brown hair arrived before population explosion, before global migration intensified, before cultural identity hardened around appearance. It secured its place before competition became meaningful. That timing is everything. Traits that arrive late must fight. Traits that arrive early simply remain. Brown hair remained. If we imagine evolution as a long corridor filled with doors that gradually close, brown hair walked through an open door very early and never had to look back. Others arrived later when space was limited, when isolation was required, when conditions were narrower. They survived, but they did not dominate. Brown hair did not need isolation, it needed openness, and the early human world was wide open. This story also challenges how we think about speed itself. We associate speed with motion. But the fastest traits are often the ones that stop moving. Once brown hair reached sufficient distribution, it no longer needed to spread actively. It became self-sustaining. At that point, speed turned into inertia, and inertia is difficult to reverse. Perhaps the most unsettling implication of all is this: the traits that define humanity most deeply may be the ones we never talk about. Not intelligence, not creativity, not beauty, but tolerance, flexibility, compatibility. Brown hair embodies these qualities physically. It is the phenotype of accommodation. If humans are a species defined by movement, then the traits that survive movement best define us. Brown hair survives movement across deserts, across mountains, across oceans, across cultures. It does not demand homeostasis. It adapts just enough to remain intact. And so, when we finally stop asking why brown hair is common, and instead ask what kind of world produces a trait like this, the answer becomes clear. A world of uncertainty, a species in motion, a history without guarantees. Brown hair is what remains when nothing else can be relied upon. It is not dramatic, it is not poetic, it is not heroic, it is durable. And durability over deep time is indistinguishable from success. This is where the narration can slow to a near standstill. Because there is nothing left to resolve, no twist, no revelation, only recognition. Recognition that the most powerful forces shaping humanity do not look powerful at all. They look ordinary, they look familiar, they look like something you stopped noticing long ago. Brown hair did not conquer the world, it simply stayed long enough to become the world's background, and in doing so it taught us something difficult to accept, that survival is not always loud. That success does not always shine. And that sometimes the fastest thing of all is what never had to change. If we keep going past explanation, past analysis, past the comfort of conclusions, we arrive at a place where the story no longer feels like a documentary and starts to feel like a mirror. Because at some point the question stops being about hair. It becomes about how humans misunderstand time itself. Human intuition is built for urgency. We evolved to react to immediate threats, immediate opportunities, immediate change. Our senses are tuned to motion, contrast, difference. We notice what enters the frame suddenly, what breaks the pattern, what demands response. But evolution does not operate on urgency. It operates on accumulation, and accumulation feels boring to creatures who are wired to notice interruption. Brown hair is a casualty of that mismatch, not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks urgency. If you imagine human history compressed into a single day, most of what we talk about would happen in the final few seconds. Empires, ideologies, science, technology, they flash into existence and vanish almost immediately. Brown hair would appear before sunrise and remain unchanged until midnight. No fanfare, no plot twist, just presence. Presence is one of the hardest concepts for humans to respect. We treat what is always there as if it were guaranteed, as if it required no conditions, no luck, no survival. But nothing in evolution is guaranteed. The fact that brown hair remains so widespread is not evidence of inevitability. It is evidence of repeated success under uncertainty. Again and again, across circumstances no one could predict. Think about how many chances there were for brown hair to fail. Climate shifts that punished pigmentation. migrations into unfamiliar environments. Population bottlenecks where randomness could have erased it, cultural ideals that could have selected against it. And yet none of these forces aligned strongly enough, long enough, everywhere enough to remove it. That is not luck, that is resilience. Resilience, unlike strength, does not announce itself. Strength is visible in moments of pressure. Resilience is visible only in hindsight, when something is still there after pressure has passed. Brown hair is a hindsight trait. You only notice its success when you step back far enough. There's also something profoundly unromantic about this realization, and that discomfort matters. Humans prefer stories where effort is rewarded, where struggle produces victory, where the exceptional rises above the ordinary. But evolution does not reward effort, it rewards persistence. Brown hair did not struggle, it did not strive, it did not compete aggressively, it persisted. This creates a quiet tension with how humans want to see themselves. We like to believe we are defined by what makes us special, but most of what defines us as a species is what makes us compatible with each other. Shared traits, shared structures, shared baselines. Brown hair is one of those baselines, and baselines are powerful because they reduce friction. They allow systems to scale. They make coordination easier. They make difference intelligible. A world where every trait were rare would be chaotic. Common traits stabilize perception. Brown hair stabilizes human appearance. This stabilization is not about control or conformity. It is about coherence. A species that spreads across the planet needs coherence to remain a species. Traits that fracture too easily under mixing threaten coherence. Brown hair reinforces it. At this point, it becomes clear that brown hair did not merely survive humanity's expansion. It facilitated it, not directly, not intentionally, but by reducing one more variable that could have complicated adaptation. One less thing to recalibrate, one less constraint, one less failure point. This is the hidden logic of evolutionary success. Traits that reduce complexity survive longer than traits that add it. Brown hair simplifies adaptation. It works well enough almost everywhere. And well enough is evolution's favorite phrase. There is a temptation to interpret this as mediocrity. But mediocrity implies comparison to a standard of excellence. Evolution does not care about excellence, it cares about continuity. Brown hair offers continuity. Continuity across geography, continuity across culture, continuity across time. It connects early humans to modern humans in a visible way that few traits do. Even as everything else changes, brown hair remains recognizable. This recognition is important. It anchors identity at a species level. When we look at ancient remains, reconstructions, or early art, brown hair feels familiar. Not exotic, not alien, familiar. That familiarity bridges deep time, and that bridge matters more than we realize, because humans struggle to feel connected to the past. We see ancient people as fundamentally different, but common traits collapse that distance. Brown hair makes ancient humans look like us, and in doing so, it reminds us that we are not as new as we think. As this realization settles in, the narrative shifts again. Brown hair stops being a trait and becomes a symbol, not of identity, but of continuity itself. It symbolizes the parts of humanity that did not need reinvention, the parts that did not break under pressure, the parts that quietly carried us forward. There is humility in this, and humility is rare in discussions about human uniqueness. We prefer to highlight what separates us from other species. But survival often comes from what binds us together. Brown hair binds. It binds not through meaning, but through repetition. Repetition across families, across generations, across millennia, each individual instance unremarkable, the sum extraordinary. This is perhaps the most difficult idea for modern minds to absorb, that greatness can emerge from repetition without intention, that success can arise without vision, that dominance can occur without ambition. Brown hair embodies all three. If we return to the idea of speed one last time, we can now see how misleading the word is. Brown hair was not fast in the way a trend is fast. It was fast in the way sediment accumulates when a river never stops flowing. Slow in moments, inevitable in total. The river of human reproduction never stopped, and brown hair settled into its course early, layer by layer, generation by generation, until it became part of the riverbed itself. At this depth, the story no longer needs argument, it doesn't need evidence, it doesn't need persuasion, it simply needs silence, because silence is where persistence becomes visible. And in that silence, we can finally understand why brown hair feels so easy to ignore. It never demanded attention, it never asked to be explained, it never tried to be special. It simply remained when everything else came and went. That is not an accident, that is not boring. That is success operating on a timescale larger than human storytelling instincts can comfortably grasp. And perhaps that is the final discomfort this story leaves us with, that what endures most deeply in humanity may not be our brilliance, our creativity, or our ambition, but our ability to carry forward what works quietly, faithfully, without ever needing to notice it. Brown hair is one of those things, still here, still common, still doing exactly what it has always done. And in a universe defined by change, that might be the rarest achievement of all. At some point, when a story stretches long enough, explanation gives way to contemplation. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying more begins to feel like circling the same truth from different angles, each pass revealing not new facts, but deeper implications. This is where the narration naturally drifts, not forward in time, but inward in meaning. Because brown hair, by now, is no longer the subject. Is the lens. When humans attempt to understand themselves, they instinctively look upward, toward intellect, toward creativity, toward consciousness, believing that what defines us must be elevated, exceptional, and visibly distinct from the rest of the living world. But evolution does not build species from the top down. It builds them from the bottom up, from small, repeated successes that stack quietly until they form a foundation so stable that everything else can be built on top of it. Brown hair is one of those foundations. What makes this unsettling is how little intention is involved. There was no moment when brown hair was chosen, no committee of ancestors deciding its fate, no evolutionary goal it was striving toward. It spread because, in a moving species inhabiting an unpredictable world, it created fewer problems than most alternatives. And systems that create fewer problems tend to survive longer than systems that promise greatness but demand precision. Precision is fragile, it requires conditions to remain narrow, it breaks when context shifts. Brown hair never required precision, it required tolerance, tolerance for sunlight that changed across latitudes, tolerance for mixing across populations, tolerance for cultural reinterpretation, tolerance for indifference, and indifference paradoxically is one of the safest places a trait can exist. Indifference means no one is trying to remove you, no one is trying to isolate you. No one is building systems specifically to suppress or elevate you. You simply pass through generations unnoticed, and in doing so you accumulate presence. Brown hair accumulated presence. This accumulation produces an illusion of inevitability. We look around today and assume it had to be this way. But inevitability is always an illusion created by survival. Everything that remains appears inevitable only because the alternatives are gone. Brown hair looks inevitable because we cannot see the countless other possibilities that disappeared without record. Human history, like biological history, is deeply biased toward survivors. We tell stories about what endured and forget what failed. And because brown hair endured so thoroughly, it fades into the background of those stories, becoming so obvious that it escapes scrutiny. It becomes invisible not because it lacks importance, but because it lacks absence. Absence is what triggers curiosity. Presence that never leaves becomes taken for granted. This is why brown hair is rarely discussed with the same fascination as rarer traits. It never left the room. If we imagine a future where humans no longer exist and another intelligence reconstructs our species from fragments, bones, artifacts, genetic residue, it is entirely possible that brown hair would be reconstructed not as a defining feature, but as a default assumption. Not because it was universal, but because it was statistically dominant. And statistics shape reconstructions more than stories ever do. That future observer might conclude that humanity favored moderation, that our physical traits clustered around middle values, that we survived not by pushing boundaries constantly, but by maintaining balance. They would not be entirely wrong. Brown hair supports that interpretation. This reframing has consequences for how we understand progress. Modern narratives often equate progress with transformation. with becoming something new, with leaving the past behind. But biological success is often the opposite. It is about carrying the past forward intact enough that adaptation does not require reinvention. Brown hair is carried forward intact. Even now, as humans explore genetic modification, artificial reproduction, and technologies that blur the boundary between biology and design, the underlying distributions remain stubbornly conservative. Radical change is rare, incremental continuity dominates, and brown hair sits comfortably inside that continuity. There is a philosophical discomfort here because it suggests that much of what persists in humanity does so without permission, without awareness, without intention. We are less in control of our long-term outcomes than we like to believe. Brown hair reminds us of this quietly. It reminds us that the species-level story operates independently of individual desires, that what feels meaningful to a person may be irrelevant to the population, that what dominates culturally may vanish biologically, and that what dominates biologically may never become culturally interesting. This separation between cultural meaning and biological persistence is one of the hardest things for humans to accept. We want alignment, we want what we value to last, but evolution does not negotiate with values, it negotiates with conditions. Brown hair satisfied enough conditions for long enough, that is all. As the narration continues, it becomes clear that brown hair functions almost like a control variable in the human experiment, a constant against which change can be measured. When everything else shifts, languages, technologies, beliefs, brown hair provides continuity. It allows us to recognize ourselves across time. Recognition is not trivial. A species that cannot recognize itself risks fragmentation. Common traits anchor identity at a level deeper than culture. Brown hair contributes to that anchoring. This does not mean it defines humanity, but it supports the definition, like a background color that makes the foreground legible. Remove it and the picture changes entirely. At this depth, the story of brown hair begins to resemble a story about entropy. Systems tend toward states that require the least energy to maintain. Brown hair requires little maintenance, little specialization, little defense. It is energetically cheap in evolutionary terms, and cheap solutions spread. Energy efficiency is rarely celebrated, but it governs almost everything that lasts. Stars burn until fuel is exhausted. Ecosystems stabilize around efficient exchanges. Organisms persist when their traits do not drain resources unnecessarily. Brown hair is efficient. Efficiency over time looks like wisdom, not because it is wise in intent, but because it avoids mistakes repeatedly. Brown hair avoided enough mistakes to remain. The more we examine it, the clearer it becomes that brown hair is not an accident of history. It is a statistical outcome of a species that moved fast, mixed widely, and survived unpredictability. Given those conditions, something like brown hair was almost guaranteed to emerge and persist, not because it was destined, but because it was compatible. Compatibility is the final word here. Compatible with climate, compatible with genetics, compatible with culture, compatible with indifference. Brown hair did not demand the world change for it. It fit into the world as it was. And fitting in over deep time beats standing out. Standing out attracts attention. Attention attracts pressure. Pressure demands response. Brown hair avoided the entire chain. This avoidance is not weakness. It is strategy, one without consciousness, without planning, without awareness. A strategy embedded in probability itself. As the narration stretches onward, there is a sense that the story no longer needs new material, only patience, because patience is how persistence reveals itself. Brown hair teaches us that not everything important arrives with drama. Some things arrive early, stay quietly, and shape everything that follows without ever asking to be noticed. And perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all is this, that if we are looking for what truly defines humanity, we may need to stop looking at what shines brightest and start paying attention to what never left, still there, still common, still unremarkable. Still carrying the species forward, one generation at a time, without ever asking for credit. And that, more than anything else, is what makes brown hair fast. At a certain depth, the narration stops behaving like an argument and starts behaving like a long breath. Not something you rush through, not something you punctuate with conclusions, but something you inhabit, slowly, patiently, because the meaning is no longer located in any single sentence, but in the cumulative weight of all of them pressing together across time. This is where the story naturally wants to go next. Human beings have a tendency to confuse visibility with importance, as though what draws the eye must also be what carries the greatest consequence, and this tendency has shaped nearly every way we talk about history, biology, culture, and even ourselves. We document revolutions, not routines. We celebrate innovation, not maintenance. We remember disruption, not continuation. And yet, when you examine what actually survives, what crosses centuries intact, what persists through collapse and reinvention, it is almost never the disruptive force. It is the quiet one. Brown hair exists in that quiet. The reason this feels unsatisfying is because it denies us a hero. There is no protagonist here, no struggle to overcome, no adversary to defeat. Brown hair does not achieve dominance in the narrative sense. It acquires it through repetition so steady and so uneventful that it never registers as an event at all. This absence of drama is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. If you imagine evolution as a vast, ongoing conversation between organisms and environments, most traits speak loudly for a short time and are then drowned out by noise, while a few speak softly for so long that they begin to define the language itself. Brown hair speaks softly, so softly that after a while you stop hearing it as speech and start hearing it as silence. But silence in this context is not emptiness, it is saturation. Saturation is what happens when something becomes so thoroughly integrated that removing it would require dismantling the system it supports. Brown hair reached saturation early in human history. Once it did, every new generation inherited not just the trait itself, but the statistical inertia of all previous generations carrying it forward. At that point, dominance no longer needed reinforcement. It became self-sustaining. This is one of the most difficult concepts for modern minds to grasp because we live in a world where change is constant, where novelty is rewarded, and where staying the same is often treated as failure. But biological time does not share our values. It does not reward reinvention for its own sake. It rewards traits that reduce risk across unpredictable futures. Brown hair reduces risk. Risk reduction is rarely noticed because its success is invisible. A catastrophe avoided leaves no evidence. A failure prevented does not appear in records. Brown hair's success is largely a record of failures that never happened, climates that did not eliminate it, migrations that did not erase it, mixtures that did not dissolve it. Its history is written in absences. This is why the trait feels oddly resistant to storytelling. Stories require conflict. Brown hair avoids conflict. It does not provoke strong reactions from environment or society. It does not force adaptation elsewhere. It simply integrates. And integration is the opposite of narrative tension, yet integration is precisely what allows systems to scale. Human populations scaled dramatically. Traits that could not scale with them fell away. Brown hair scaled effortlessly. It required no special accommodations, no narrow conditions, no protective barriers. It moved wherever humans moved, embedded in the same probabilities that governed reproduction itself. At this scale, it becomes clear that brown hair is less a trait than a statistical attractor, a stable outcome that human populations naturally fall into given enough mixing, movement, and time. Once populations reach sufficient size and connectivity, extreme traits tend to soften, rare traits tend to localize, and moderate traits tend to dominate. Brown hair occupies that moderate zone. Moderation in evolutionary terms is not compromise, it is strategy. A strategy that avoids the penalties of extremes while capturing enough of their advantages to remain viable. Brown hair does not maximize pigmentation, it does not minimize it. It settles into a range that works almost everywhere most of the time. And almost everywhere most of the time is where survival lives. This pattern appears again and again in nature, not in the fastest animal but in the adaptable one, not in the most aggressive species but in the resilient one, not in the most specialized organism but in the generalist. Brown hair is a generalist trait. Generalists endure. As we continue to stretch this narration forward, the emphasis shifts subtly from explanation to perspective. Because once you see brown hair as an example of generalist success, it becomes impossible not to see the same logic operating throughout human evolution. Our diets, our physiology, our social structures. Again and again, what survives is what tolerates variation without breaking. This is why brown hair feels strangely modern despite being ancient. It fits a world defined by mixing, movement, and uncertainty. A world where rigid specialization is a liability. A world where adaptability matters more than optimization. Brown hair was prepared for this world long before it existed. Prepared is the wrong word, of course. Nothing prepared it. It simply remained compatible as the world changed. Compatibility is not foresight. It is alignment, and alignment is rare. We return once more to the human tendency to overlook foundations. We begin to understand why this story matters beyond hair color. Foundations are easy to ignore precisely because they work. We only notice them when they fail. Brown hair has not failed at a species-wide level, so it escapes scrutiny. This invisibility can feel unfair, as though success has gone unacknowledged. But evolution does not seek acknowledgement. It does not require appreciation. It only requires continuation. Brown hair continues, and so the narration stretches onward, not toward resolution, but toward a kind of stillness. A recognition that some truths do not culminate, they persist. They hover beneath the noise of history, unchanged by the rise and fall of everything built on top of them. Brown hair hovers there. If you were to remove every modern layer, every mirror, every photograph, every cultural meaning, and imagine humanity stripped down to survival and reproduction alone, brown hair would still be there, doing exactly what it has always done. Passing on, that endurance reframes how we think about success. Success is not always expansion, not always visibility, not always transformation. Sometimes success is simply remaining an option, remaining viable, remaining probable. Brown hair remained probable. Probability is the quiet engine of this entire story. Not destiny, not design, probability. Over enough time, probable outcomes become dominant outcomes. Brown hair benefited from probability early, and probability kept paying dividends. This is why even now, even with unprecedented control over appearance, the underlying distribution does not collapse. Surface choices fluctuate wildly. Deep probabilities do not. Brown hair lives in the deep layer. At this point, the narration almost resists continuation because the pattern has revealed itself fully, not as a conclusion, but as a lens, a way of seeing. Brown hair is not interesting because it is brown. It is interesting because it teaches us how survival actually works when nothing dramatic happens. And that may be the most difficult lesson of all, that the forces shaping humanity most powerfully are not the ones that announce themselves, but the ones that operate patiently, invisibly, and without interruption long enough that we mistake their presence for inevitability. Brown hair is one of those forces, still here, still common, still unremarked, still doing the quiet work of persistence while history continues to rush noisily overhead. And so, after all this time, after following a single unremarkable trait across migrations, climates, cultures, and centuries, we arrive at a strange and quiet realization that what endures is not always what dazzles us, that what survives is not always what demands attention. That some of the most powerful forces shaping humanity do not announce themselves with brilliance or drama, but instead remain so constant, so reliable, so deeply woven into our existence that we forget they are even there. Brown hair never asked to be noticed. It never needed to be defended. It never demanded meaning. It simply remained through uncertainty, through movement, through generations that rose and fell without ever realizing they were carrying something forward that had already solved the problem of survival long before anyone thought to ask the question. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside this entire story. That persistence is not loud. That success does not always look like victory, and that sometimes the fastest thing of all is what never had to change. If you're still here, if you stayed with this video all the way to the end, then you are someone who understands slow ideas, long timelines, and stories that refuse to rush toward easy conclusions. And if that's you, I invite you to subscribe. Because this channel is built for people who are willing to sit with questions longer than most, to explore ideas that don't fit neatly into headlines, and to think about humanity not just as it appears today, but as it unfolds across deep time. And if you did make it to the very end, leave a comment, not just anything, but tell me what stayed with you from this video. Was it the idea of persistence, the invisibility of dominance, or the realization that what feels ordinary now may be the result of success so complete that it no longer needs to be explained? I read the comments, and if you're here at the end of a story like this, I'd genuinely like to hear yours.